Hi, this is part 3 of our Civil War lecture. By 1863, the Union was getting the upper hand, but the war was far from over. The Union's blockade was starting to choke the South, leading to Confederate forces having little supplies and civilians in the South having little to no food. The Union was beginning and would succeed with its campaign to gain full control of the Mississippi River in 1863, which would cut the Confederacy in half and effectively give the Union control of the entire Western theater. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia were still basically dominant in the Eastern theater, however, and winning brilliant victories like the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was a very important victory for Lee and the Confederates, although it was a costly one because Stonewall Jackson was killed there from friendly fire, so Lee lost probably his most capable subordinate in that battle. Lee was growing more confident in the ability of his army, but also more desperate because of the overall situation. He knew that if the South did not achieve a truly monumental victory that had strategic consequences, things might be over soon. If the South did not turn the tide of the overall war or convince European powers to recognize the Confederacy and force the Union to negotiate, Lee knew that the Confederacy would crumble around him, even while he continued to rack up victories with his army in Virginia. So he planned to invade the North. He'd already tried that once before he was stopped at the Battle of Antietam. He decides to do this again, and that he's going to invade the North with about 75,000 troops. This is a much smaller army than the Union has at this point in this area, but it's still, this is about the largest Lee's army ever is. It's about 75 to 80,000 men. So he's taking pretty much his entire force, his entire army of Northern Virginia, and he's going to invade the North to try to get his decisive and stunning victory. He hoped that by fighting on Northern soil, he could, number one, give the South kind of some breathing room, so take the fighting away from the South and bring the devastation to the North instead. Number two, he hoped to capture some much-needed supplies for his army. His men were lacking basic things like shoes and blankets, which is not good for an army that has to march dozens of miles per day sometimes. Number three, he hoped to encourage the Northern Peace Movement, the so-called Copperheads that I talked about earlier, into pressuring Lincoln to negotiate with the South. So he thought by kind of threatening the North and actually being physically, attacking the North, that might encourage the Northern Peace Movement. There's some reasons to believe that. There's some reasons to think that maybe that's not true. Lastly, he was hoping to force Union commanders who would be desperate to protect the North. He was hoping to force those Union commanders into overreacting and making mistakes in a very large battle that would give him that decisive battle, that he could send a message that the Confederacy was for real, and that would hopefully lead to European countries recognizing the Confederacy, that sort of thing. So he's kind of trying to set the stage for a large, decisive battle that will prove the Confederacy's cause. That's what he's trying to do more than anything. The Union Army was kind of caught by surprise when Lee invaded the North, had not been expecting it, but the Union Army caught up to him at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, kind of western Pennsylvania, on July 1st, 1863. The first day of the battle was mostly kind of skirmishes, maybe about a quarter of each side's troops were engaged in the first day, so they're both trying just to secure favorable ground while the rest of the armies could assemble and get ready for the battle. So they ran into each other by accident, so they're just kind of maneuvering for the favorable ground at the beginning. The North is able to secure the high ground of hills near the town of Gettysburg. So Gettysburg, and if you ever have the opportunity, I highly recommend visiting any Civil War battlefield. Are incredible what they've done to preserve them and make it so that you can kind of experience and see what it was like. But Gettysburg in particular is something that you really have to see to appreciate the scale of this battle and what happened there. But Gettysburg is this area is they're not really high hills, but they're very rocky and bouldery. And bouldery is totally a word. But so having the high ground is a big advantage that gives the Union a much better position, both to fire down on the Confederates, and also it's much easier to defend this higher ground. So on day 2, the battle really got going with all of the troops, about 65,000 in total for the South. So not quite all of Lee's army, but most of it are engaged, and about 85,000 Union soldiers are present throughout most of this battle. And pretty much all of them are fighting on day 2. The North was positioned on a J-shaped line of hills. So look at the PowerPoint. You can see the map of the battle there, or maps of the battle. I think I'll post multiple ones of each day. So the North was positioned on this kind of J-shaped line of hills, and the South tried to knock them off of that by attacking the very end, that very tail end of the J, the bottom of the J kind of thing. This position was a hill called Little Round Top, and it was held by the 20th Maine, which was led by an abolitionist, who was Colonel Joshua Chamberlain. The South attacked and almost overran the 20th Maine's position. The Union soldiers they were out of ammo. Literally, they had no more bullets at all. So Chamberlain ordered a last-ditch bayonet charge. So, bayonet is like the knife that you put on the end of these rifles. And so then you can kind of use it as a spear type of thing. So he orders a bayonet charge, and they run down the hill and attack the Confederates hand-to-hand with their bayonets and whatever they can to defend themselves. They don't have any more ammunition. And this kind of desperate charge works and gets the Confederates to retreat from this hill and kind of protects the overall Union position. If this one hill, if the Union had been pushed back of this one hill, that would have meant basically defeat for the entire Union army. But Chamberlain and his men hold on there. Chamberlain wins the Congressional Medal of Honor. He goes on to become governor of Maine. So it's a pretty big deal for him, and a pretty important moment for the Union. So the Union held its ground on day 2. Day 3, the final day of the battle, is sometimes known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Because this is kind of the moment when, after day 3, victory for the Confederacy was no longer possible. The war would continue on, but the Confederacy had kind of lost its chance to secure a victory and secure its independence because of what happens on day 3. Lee made a massive mistake on day 3, and he did this because of his overconfidence in his own troops, who had proved themselves time and time again to be better than their Union opponents. And he also did this because of his desperation, that he knows he has to secure a huge kind of war-changing victory that will completely shift the tide of the war that's going against the Confederacy throughout most of the United States. This mistake is called Pickett's Charge, because the kind of leading commander in it was Pickett. This is his last name. So this was an all-out attack on the center of the Union lines. So Lee hoped that he could push the Union off the hill in the center of the Union lines, and then he would secure that hill, and there's kind of a road behind the hill. So if he could push through in the center there, then he would be able to, all of the Union forces would be very vulnerable to being attacked from behind. So the whole Union army would be in a very bad position and probably suffer massive casualties if Lee could just break through in this one point. That's his goal. So Lee moved all of his army's artillery to this one spot to hopefully overwhelm the Union forces there. But the Union, so General Meade was the commander, he anticipated this, and the Union forces were able to hide kind of on the backside of the hill when the Confederate artillery was firing. So the Union is on the high ground, the Confederates are on the low ground, they fire their artillery, but the Union, they just retreat to the kind of backside of the hill, and that makes it so that they're basically protected from the Confederate artillery. The artillery doesn't accomplish anything. The Confederates mounted their attack anyways, so they fire all their cannons and artillery, and then it's going to be the infantry are going to charge forward and take this position. They were going to charge this one spot with about 12,500 of Lee's best men. And this was his only kind of reserve force that had not been engaged very much in the battle. So it's his only men who are kind of fresh and not exhausted from the 3 days of fighting already. This is commanded by, overall, it's commanded by Lieutenant General James Longstreet. And as I mentioned, the first unit in the attack belongs to General George Pickett, so that's why it's known as Pickett's Charge. They had to cross about 3/4 of a mile of open terrain under heavy fire from Union forces on the hill. So, as I mentioned, the Union commander, General Meade, anticipated this attack and had reinforced this position. The Confederate artillery barrage had accomplished nothing, basically. So now you have Lee's men crossing, 3/4 of a mile and just being pummeled by artillery and rifle fire from the top of this very commanding hill. Well, it's not a huge hill, but it's a pretty significant difference in elevation. It's a good position for the Union. And so they're just being pummeled for, minutes, at least about 15 minutes, that they're completely vulnerable. There's no cover. There's nothing they can do other than move forwards. And the result was pure slaughter for the Confederates. They did reach the hill, but they couldn't get that far up it because they were suffering such huge casualties. And they suffered about 50% casualties overall. So in about 15 minutes, 6,000 men were killed or wounded in Pickett's charge. And Pickett's division, the very first kind of lead unit of Pickett's charge, was basically wiped out. It basically 100% killed or wounded in the attack. So this did not succeed. So that's why it's known as the high water mark, because if they had succeeded in capturing this position, maybe Lee would have gotten his victory that would have changed the course of the war. But this attack is defeated, and Lee is defeated with the Battle of Gettysburg. So this meant that not only had Lee lost the battle, he had failed to force the Union back, he was unable to continue his offensive into the north because of this, and has to retreat into the south. But he also lost a big portion of his best troops and his best officers on that day, men that he could never replace. The South was so crippled by that time from the Union blockade, from the Union's control of the West and dividing the Confederate territory, and from just the fact that the South doesn't have as many men to begin with, that there's no way Lee could ever replace the men that were lost on this day. And especially not, these are men that have been fighting for 3 years, that are, battle hardened, that they're kind of the best of Lee's army. There's no way Lee's army is ever going to really recover from losing that kind of casualties in one day. The casualties for the overall battle were close to even, so about 23,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded overall, and about 28,000 for the South. There's fewer Southern soldiers to begin with. They suffer slightly higher casualties. And the North, they can replace those that they lost in this battle. They're continuing to raise new troops to create new units, whereas the South can't do that. Those casualties are huge and significant for the Union, but they're replaceable. And so Lee has lost all of these men, and he failed to alter the overall dynamic of the war, which is that the South is clearly losing, no matter what kind of victories, kind of minor victories, Lee can score in Virginia. On the same day as the Battle of Gettysburg wrapped up, the Union was already victorious with the Siege of Vicksburg, which was the final battle that secured the Union's control of the Mississippi River. So that meant, fittingly enough, on July 4th, 1863, this was the turning point in the war. These two decisive Union victories at Gettysburg and the Siege of Vicksburg on the same day, or they're both completed on the same day. Siege of Vicksburg has been going on for a couple of months already. So the war wasn't over, but after this point, it was very likely that the Union would win, and it was just kind of a question of what the end would be and how much the South was willing to suffer before it surrendered, and what terms the South would be given when it did surrender. So it's, it's a question of what's going to happen, not who's going to win this war at this point. These victories helped galvanize the North, proving that Lincoln knew what he was doing and that eventually the Union would be reunited as Lincoln had promised. Lincoln gave his famous Gettysburg Address a couple of months afterwards when he was dedicating the cemetery for the soldiers who had been killed at that battle. And in that address, he drove home the point that the Union was fighting for, quote, a new birth of freedom. And this meant that the Union was fighting for much more than just the, kind of individual pieces of things that, these individual goals of reunite the Union, emancipate slaves, those sorts of things. Those smaller goals, the overall goal of the Union was much bigger, this new birth of freedom. So, it meant that it kind of ties this all together, that freeing the slaves and preserving the Union, these have to go hand in hand, is what Lincoln is saying. And that this war, as horrible as it is redefining what it means to, what American democracy means in a way that's improving American democracy, is what, Lincoln was trying to say. Although General Meade won at Gettysburg, Lincoln fired him as the overall Union commander anyways, because Meade, like McClellan in the past, had been kind of a little bit too timid. Not quite as bad as McClellan, but General Meade did not attack Lee as Lee was retreating from Gettysburg, which is probably a mistake. So he didn't capitalize. General Meade was kind of willing to we won the battle, that's good enough, rather than, he could have possibly basically destroyed Lee on that, on that day or afterwards. Lincoln made Ulysses S. Grant the overall Union commander after this. So he's been looking for somebody who will fight, and he decides Grant's his guy. So after using 7 other commanders already throughout the war, 7 different Union generals have overall command of the Union military forces. Before Grant, Lincoln finally found a good one that he was going to stick with in Grant, somebody who is reliable, aggressive, and had the kind of killer instinct to see this war to its bloody conclusion. Sherman was also elevated to a more important position, leading a kind of separate Union force. So he sort of reported to Grant, but he was kind of independent on his own, leading another Union army. So that was another important kind of change. Robert E. Lee offered his resignation for his mistake at the Battle of Gettysburg, but the Confederate President Jefferson Davis refused to allow Lee to resign, realizing that Lee is still the best general of either side in this war, and that the Confederacy, if they're going to continue fighting, whatever mistake Lee has made, they still need Robert E. Lee. Despite Gettysburg and the war pointing towards Union victory eventually, Lincoln was still afraid that he might lose the election of 1864. The Northern public was still pretty impatient for the war to be over and tired with its very high cost in terms of, not only money, but of course men. The grinded out kind of total war or attrition approach of Generals Grant and Sherman was successful and was, kept driving and pushing the war towards its conclusion, but it was also kind of unpopular because of the high cost. People in the North looked at it as, well, we've just about won this war, so why should we continue to, have these battles where we lose tens of thousands of men? Can't they, the Union has huge advantages by this point. Can't they kind of sit back and relax a little bit and not put so many men at risk? Well, the answer is to force a Confederate, as desperate as the Confederates are, if you're going to force them to surrender, you have to continue applying that pressure. If you let up, then the Confederates, that kind of might give them some breathing room and encourage them to continue resisting. The Democrats nominated General George B. McClellan, so the kind of cautious general. The Democrats nominated him for president in 1864 to run against Lincoln, and he ran as a peace candidate. So he had been very popular with the soldiers in the Union Army because he had been so cautious with their lives. And not, wasn't perceived to be throwing away their lives and getting them killed for silly things like winning battles, like Grant and Sherman were. So the Democrats, and of course this election is only taking place in the North. So the Democrats hoped that the Union soldiers would vote for General McClellan and get him elected, and then they could end the war. They could negotiate a settlement with the South. There were a number of timely victories, though, before the election, including Sherman capturing Atlanta and the Navy capturing Mobile Bay, Alabama, so an important southern port. These victories proved that the Union was not far from victory, and that Union soldiers, and it ended up that Union soldiers overwhelmingly voted for Lincoln because they believed in that new birth of freedom that Lincoln had declared as kind of the overarching purpose of the United States in this war. And they believed that the war was worth it, no matter what the sacrifices were. So the soldiers did not vote for McClellan, and Lincoln won it wasn't the only reason he won, but that support, that overwhelming support of the Union soldiers was very important to his victory. He won his re-election for his second term, and Lincoln was supposed to therefore oversee the end of the war and its aftermath, which probably would have turned out a lot better for the country if he had actually been able to do that. Despite things going the Union's way and Lincoln's way, the war was as brutal as ever, or even more so. Sherman, after capturing Atlanta, went on what is known as his March to the Sea in late 1864, going from Atlanta to the coast of Georgia, so Savannah, Georgia, and then up the coast of Carolina. And the point of this was not so much to capture territory or to defeat Confederate military forces, but the point was to destroy the South's capacity to continue the war. So Sherman said, quote, "We are not only fighting armies, but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war as well as their organized armies." So he is targeting civilians. Sherman's attitude, similar to Grant's, maybe even more extreme. So he infamously believed that, famous quote for him is "war is hell." So he's the one who said that. And so if war is hell, then therefore anything that would help to bring an end to the war more quickly was the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, no matter how brutal it might seem. So Sherman and his army therefore marched and destroyed everything, burning fields and plantations, destroying railroads. So you can see the PowerPoint of some of the examples of what they were doing, killing livestock. Anything that might supply the Confederate army was a target. He was not killing civilians, and this was, so he was very deliberate and very disciplined, and kept his troops very disciplined and organized. So there was not looting, there was not killing of civilians. They were rounded up and put into prison camps or sent elsewhere to kind of refugee camps. But he was very deliberately destroying the civilian belongings and their property and everything, destroying their lives, just not killing them. So it's debatable. You can probably understand Sherman's point that the best thing to do is end this war quickly. But on the other hand, you can maybe understand why even to this day Sherman's name is a kind of a dirty word in some areas of the South. As brutal as it was, Sherman's march was incredibly effective, so it accomplished its goal. It not only destroyed a lot of supplies for the Confederacy, but it also led to many Southern soldiers in other parts of the country deserting the Confederate Army because they felt a need that they needed to return to their homes and protect their families and property if they were, fighting in some other, area of the country, which many of them were. They felt like they needed to go try to protect their homes and property and their families rather than continuing to fight in the Confederate Army. So this helped accelerate the disintegration of the Confederate military, which is really starting to accelerate that. The desertions are increasing with Confederate soldiers not having any food or supplies and facing these kind of huge threats to their families and their livelihoods and things like that. Lincoln was inaugurated for his second term on March 4th, 1865. He was not triumphant despite his political victory or the nearing military victory in the Civil War, though. He called for a pragmatic and moderate approach to Reconstruction of the South and of the Union. So he did not want severe punishments for the South, and he wanted it to be relatively easy for Southern states to rejoin the Union. So he called for 10% of the population to swear an oath of allegiance to the Union, and to also that they would respect the Emancipation Proclamation, and that would be good enough to readmit a former Confederate state. While he rejected triumphalism and urged the country to reunite in kind of the most orderly and peaceful fashion as possible, Lincoln still emphasized the evil of slavery as the cause for the war, and described the war as a divine punishment for, quote, every drop of blood drawn with the lash, and for 250 years of unrequited toil. So he's saying the South had basically deserved this for having the evil of slavery and permitting it to exist, or even more so that the entire United States deserved the suffering of the war. The South suffered more, but obviously the Union is suffering as well, and that for tolerating slavery, this is their kind of punishment. He closed this second inaugural address by saying there should be, quote, malice towards none. And he said that instead the nation should strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace. So that's his overriding goal, although protecting the newly freed slaves is an important part, and it's something that he's serious about forcing the South to change in those ways. But he's also serious about we're not going to hang people for treason and things like that. We're just going to try to reunite the country as best that we can. Unfortunately, though, Lincoln would not live to implement that vision for peace, and the country was much worse off for it. So the end of the war. By early 1865, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was dwindling away, and most other major Confederate armies were nearly gone as well. The Army of Northern Virginia had went from about 80 to 90,000 soldiers at its height to about only 28,000 by early 1865. So it had suffered tremendous casualties at all of the battles, but especially at Gettysburg. It had suffered many desertions. It had lacked supplies, which led to more desertions, and also led to many Confederate soldiers getting sick and possibly dying or not being able to fight at least. So, Confederate soldiers lacked things like shoes and other basics, and often had very little food, if any food. And there were no reinforcements or new recruits coming, so the South's population was smaller. All the white men basically were already fighting or had fought and are no longer capable of fighting, or have deserted and are kind of hiding out and running away, and kind of being a little bit of a problem because some of the deserters banded together and kind of were like raiders that would steal food and things like that, and then go hide places. So that's not good for, keeping an army together. Southern transportation and communication networks are completely broken down by the Union, so they can't, even where there is supplies for the Confederates, they can't get it to the soldiers that need it, or get it to the places that need it. So the Confederacy is really in a rough spot. Still, Lee was holding his army together, and these were hardened veterans who would not be easy to defeat. So despite all of their hardships that are put upon them, these are very, very tough men after 4 or 5 years, 4 years of intense fighting, that they've grown accustomed to some of these hardships, and they're, very dedicated to their cause, the ones that have stuck around. Unless if they do desert, which many of them still are, but the ones that are sticking around are pretty dedicated. So Grant was trying to end the war, so he continued to pursue Lee's army. He knew that if Lee surrendered, basically the rest of the Confederacy would give up. So Lee was not actually in charge of the rest of the Confederate forces, but Grant recognized Lee has the most prestige, commands the most important Confederate army. So if Lee gives up, probably the rest of the Confederacy will give up. Grant, though, because he has so many men, is able to do multiple things at once. So he also is trying to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. Grant has massive reinforcements. He has at least 100,000 soldiers as part of his Army of the Potomac, plus many other large Union armies nearby. The overall military strength by 1865 of the Confederacy and of the Union, there was about 175,000 Confederates in the Confederate military by that moment, versus about 600,000 in the Union Army by that time. So the Union, in most battles has at least 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 advantage in most areas. And that allows Grant to just kind of put pressure on everything. He doesn't have to pick and choose what his objectives should be. Lee, rather than defend Richmond and risk his army being destroyed, decided to abandon the Confederate capital to the Union. He headed towards North Carolina, hoping that he could join up with another smaller Confederate force there, so that they could kind of unite forces and be a little bit stronger because of that. Grant, with his massive number advantage, though, was able to position himself to cut off Lee even while he was capturing Richmond. So Lee, Grant can kind of do everything he wants to do, put pressure on all fronts. There were a number of battles and skirmishes after Grant had kind of cut off Lee from going to North Carolina. These further weakened Lee's army and ensured that the Union had completely cut off Lee's forces from escape or resupply. Most importantly, General George Armstrong Custer, yes, that Custer's last stand guy, later on in history. So General George Armstrong Custer, with Union cavalry, was able to attack and destroy basically Lee's entire supply convoy that he has with his army. So Lee's army has, they'd had very few supplies before. Now they have nothing. They have no food except for maybe a little bit that they have in their backpacks or something like that. So cornered and without even, any food or ammo other than what, the individual soldier is carrying, Lee decided to surrender on April 9th, 1865. He had refused a few earlier proposals, but at least, he decided to surrender at this point, realizing that any further fighting would just be suicidal, basically. Grant followed Lincoln's call of reestablishing a peace with malice towards none. So he kind of followed that policy. Grant gave generous surrender terms. He said that none of the Confederate soldiers would be imprisoned. They just had to give up their weapons and go home. Grant, he allowed the Confederate officers to keep their sidearms, so the officers got to keep their pistols, which is kind of a symbolic, sort of a thing of honoring them and their kind of valor and that sort of thing. So it's not a, like a huge practical thing that they get to keep their pistols, but and swords as well. But it's sort of honoring the Confederates and saying, you were a very worthy enemy, and we respect you even in your moment of surrender. And the Confederate soldiers also got to keep all of the horses and mules of the Confederate army, of Lee's army. So the Confederacy was kind of running out of animals to transport its stuff, because that's been something that the Union has been targeting, as killing livestock, as I mentioned. But after they surrender, Grant says that the remaining horses and mules are the Confederate soldiers get to keep those, take them home, so that way they can use them in the next season to plant their crops, that sort of thing, or it also will help them to get back home. So something that will make their lives much easier to get back home and to reestablish to rebuild their lives after the war is over. So these are things that Grant didn't have to do and aren't really standard, aren't really normal things when an army surrenders. But Grant, wants this to be something that that it's not a lot of punishment for the Confederacy, that the Confederates can give up and not be afraid, because there's still ones that haven't surrendered, so they can not be afraid when they surrender, encourage other Confederate forces to surrender. Upon announcing the surrender of Lee's army to his own Union forces, the Union soldiers cheered, but Grant ordered them to immediately stop, which he later explained by saying that the Confederates were now our countrymen, and we did not want to exult in over their downfall. So he's saying, this is, again, it's kind of honoring the sacrifice that the Confederates have made, even if it was in a cause that the Grant and the Union don't believe in and don't believe was just. They still, recognize that these are their countrymen, that the nation is going to need to reunite and rejoin together. So there's no point in adding insult to injury or rubbing salt in wounds or what have you. Lee only surrendered his own army of Northern Virginia, although it was the most important and symbolic of the Confederate forces. Its surrender did not guarantee that the rest of the Confederacy would surrender. Most of these still existing Confederate forces were in just as bad of shape, or maybe even worse shape than Lee's. And they were facing the same kind of impossible situation of being outnumbered 2-1, 3-1, having no supplies, having no reinforcements, just being kind of hounded by superior Union forces everywhere. So the same things that drove Lee to surrender are kind of driving a lot of these other ones to surrender. And with Lee, kind of the most respected figure in the Confederacy, surrendering, others were quick to follow suit. That kind of gave them permission that, okay, if Robert E. Lee is giving up, we can give up now too. So by May, the last battle of the Civil War had been fought, and the vast majority of the Confederate military had surrendered, although a few did hold out until about June. There was a few kind of holdouts that lasted a little longer. Okay, so that's it for the end of the Civil War. Next time, we'll talk about the consequences of the war and the period after the war, which is known as Reconstruction. So we'll see you then.